It hurts. I can't move. Emily Carter's voice broke across the frozen clearing, thin and trembling against the sharp bite of December air, and for a moment the entire Blackwood pack stood perfectly still, as if the wind itself had stopped to listen. Snow drifted lazily from a pale gray sky, settling in her dark hair and along the sleeves of her simple wool coat as she lay on the packed ground of the winter-proving field, her breath coming in shallow clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. The proving trials were meant to display strength, endurance, dominance, qualities praised and measured in miles run across icy terrain and in the steady control of one's wolf under pressure. But no one had prepared Emily for the way the earth would feel when it rose up too fast to meet her. 1 second she had been running, boots slipping slightly on a hidden patch of ice. The next she had fallen hard, a shock of pain radiating through her lower body, stealing the strength from her legs. She tried to push herself up, fingers digging into snow that burned with cold, but her muscles refused to obey. Around her, nearly 200 wolves watched from the perimeter of the field, their heavy coats and tailored winter suits forming a dark ring against the white landscape. Some faces showed discomfort, others indifference. A few exchanged quiet looks that said what no one voiced out loud. An Omega who could not finish the trial did not belong at its center. On the raised wooden platform overlooking the clearing stood Alpha King Adrian Blackwood, tall and motionless in a long black overcoat that fell almost to his knees, the silver crest of his pack glinting faintly at his collar. From 50 yards away, Emily could feel the weight of his gaze even through the blur of unshed tears. She hated that he would see her like this, helpless, exposed, failing in front of everyone who already believed she was too fragile for a world built on power. "Get up," someone muttered from the edge of the field, not cruelly, but firmly, as if determination alone could knit bone and sinew back together. Emily swallowed, her throat tight, and tried again. The effort sent another wave of pain through her, stealing the air from her lungs. "It hurts," she whispered again, softer now her voice, barely carrying beyond the first row of onlookers. "I can't move." The words felt like a confession, like surrender. The rules of the winter trial were clear: no interference, no assistance. Each wolf stood or fell on their own merit. To step in was to undermine the ritual itself. Snow gathered along the hem of her coat as seconds stretched unbearably long. Somewhere a child began to sniffle, hushed quickly by a parent. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the cold would swallow her whole so she would not have to see the disappointment on every face. She did not see the subtle shift on the platform above, did not see the way Adrian's jaw tightened or the way his gloved hands curled slowly at his sides as something deeper than tradition stirred within him. All she knew was the freezing ground beneath her, the ache that refused to loosen its grip, and the crushing certainty that in a pack that worshipped strength, there was no place for a girl who could not even stand. The wind shifted across the clearing, sweeping loose snow in thin ribbons over the frozen ground where Emily lay, and still no one moved. The silence was no longer awkward. It had hardened into something ceremonial, something bound by rules older than anyone standing there. At the far edge of the field, Beta Marcus Hale stepped forward half a pace, his boots crunching against the ice before he caught himself, jaw tightening as he remembered the law. The winter-proving trials were sacred. Intervention meant dishonor. Weakness meant elimination. That was how it had always been. Emily's fingers trembled where they pressed into the snow, the cold seeping through her gloves, numbing her skin while the deeper ache refused to fade. She tried to roll onto her side, but even that small motion sent a sharp protest through her lower back and hips, forcing a fragile gasp from her lips. The sky above her stretched wide and colorless, a pale sheet of winter that offered no comfort. Somewhere beyond the ring of wolves, the forest stood tall and watchful, pine branches heavy with fresh snow, as if nature itself were holding its breath. She could feel their eyes on her, dozens of them, weighing her worth in silence. An Omega who could not complete 1 mile. Across a frozen field. An Omega who had stumbled within sight of the finish line. Shame burned hotter than the cold. On the platform, Adrian Blackwood had not shifted his stance, yet something in the air around him had changed. Those closest to the stage felt at first a subtle tightening, like the pressure before a storm. His gaze never left the fallen girl. He had watched her during the earlier rounds, watched the way she encouraged the younger wolves lining up for their turn, the way she had offered her scarf to a shivering pup without hesitation. He had noticed the quiet steadiness in her, the resilience that did not shout for attention. Now that same quiet strength lay pinned beneath pain and expectation. Time, Marcus called carefully, his voice carrying across the field. It was both a warning and a mercy. If she could not rise within the allotted minute, she would be escorted out and formally dismissed from the trial. The words echoed in Emily's mind like a closing door. She forced her palms flat against the ground and pushed again, teeth clenched, breath uneven. For a split second she lifted an inch, maybe two, hope flickering fragile and bright. But her legs buckled beneath her, and she sank back into the snow. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not cruel, not mocking, but resigned. That sound hurt almost more than the fall itself. She blinked against gathering tears, refusing to let them spill freely. She did not want pity. She did not want to be the lesson whispered about next winter. She only wanted the strength to stand. 50 yards away, Adrian's gloved hand slowly unfurled at his side. The law demanded stillness. Tradition demanded detachment. But as he watched Emily lie there, small against the vast white field, something deeper than law stirred in his chest, something that did not measure worth in miles run or trials completed. The final seconds of the minute ticked down in heavy silence, and the entire pack waited to see whether their king would remain carved from ice or become something far more dangerous to the order they had always known. The last second of the allotted minute seemed to stretch longer than all the ones before it, hanging suspended in the frozen air as Emily lay motionless against the snow, her breath shallow, her hope thinning with each passing heartbeat. Around the clearing, boots shifted uneasily, while coats rustled, and somewhere in the back a young wolf asked in a whisper whether she would be sent away. Beta Marcus inhaled slowly, preparing to speak the formal words that would end her trial, but before the sound could leave his mouth, another sound cut through the cold silence. It was not loud. It was not shouted. It was simply the deliberate, unmistakable crunch of a single step descending from the wooden platform. Every head turned at once. Adrian Blackwood had moved. He did not rush. He did not look uncertain. He stepped down from the raised stage with measured calm, his long black coat brushing against his boots as he crossed the packed snow, each stride steady and unhurried. The air shifted with him, the quiet authority he carried pressing gently yet undeniably against the pack's senses. No one spoke. No one dared. The rule was clear. The king was not to interfere in the trial. His role was to witness, to judge, to remain above the outcome. Yet he continued walking until he stood only a few feet from where Emily struggled on the ground. From her place in the snow, Emily sensed the change before she saw it. The cold that had settled into her bones seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a different warmth, subtle but real. She opened her eyes, blinking against the brightness of the overcast sky, and found him there. Up close, Adrian did not look carved from ice. He looked focused, his silver eyes intent, not on the crowd, not on the beta, but entirely on her. For a moment, she forgot the ring of wolves, forgot the trial, forgot the humiliation. There was only the steady presence of the man kneeling before her, because that was what he did next. Ignoring the murmur that rippled through the pack, Adrian lowered himself onto one knee in the snow. The gesture was quiet, controlled, yet it sent a visible shock through those watching. Snow clung to the fabric of his coat as he leaned slightly closer, not touching her yet, simply bringing himself to her level. "Look at me," he said, his voice calm and even, carrying no trace of reprimand. Emily swallowed, her throat tight, and met his gaze. There was no disappointment there, no calculation, only something fierce and protective that made her chest tighten in a different way. "You are not finished," he continued softly, as if speaking to her alone despite the hundreds listening. "You are hurt." The distinction settled into her like a small flame. Hurt did not mean worthless. Hurt did not mean weak. Around them, the pack watched their king kneel in the snow beside an Omega who could not stand, and the world they thought they understood began to tilt, just slightly, towards something entirely new. Emily's breath trembled in the space between them, visible in faint white clouds that drifted upward and disappeared into the gray afternoon sky. Up close, she could see the fine snow collecting along the shoulders of Adrian's coat, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, controlled and unshaken despite the weight of every watching eye. Her pulse pounded in her ears, half from pain, half from disbelief. Kings did not kneel. Not during sacred trials. Not for someone like her. "I cannot feel my legs," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, ashamed of how fragile it sounded. The confession felt heavier than the fall itself. Adrian's expression did not change into alarm or frustration. Instead, his gaze sharpened with focus, assessing, not judging. He removed one glove slowly, deliberate in the movement, and pressed his bare hand gently against the snow near her hip, testing the ground, understanding the angle of her fall. His touch did not yet reach her, but the warmth radiating from him contrasted sharply with the cold that had seeped into her bones. Behind them, Beta Marcus shifted uneasily. "Your Majesty," he began, careful and respectful. "The trial." Adrian lifted his hand slightly, not looking away from Emily. The simple gesture was enough to silence the rest of the sentence. Tradition pressed heavily against the clearing, thick as the winter air. No alpha had ever intervened mid-trial. The law was meant to prove resilience. Yet Adrian's focus remained unwavering. "Pain can freeze the body," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear clearly, though the silence carried every syllable outward. "But it does not define your strength." Emily blinked, struggling to steady her breathing. The throbbing ache in her lower back had dulled into a deep, stubborn stiffness. Fear began to creep in beneath it, fear that something inside her had failed permanently. She searched his face for any sign that he saw the same possibility. Instead, she found resolve. Carefully, without haste, Adrian slid his arm beneath her shoulders, supporting her upper body just enough to lift her slightly from the snow. The contact was steady and respectful, his movements mindful, as though she were something precious rather than fragile. A collective intake of breath moved through the crowd like a wave. The king was touching her. Emily winced softly as he shifted her weight, but the support prevented the sharpness from returning. "Do not force it," he murmured. "Let me help you sit." The word help echoed strangely in the proving field, a place where independence was revered above all else. With controlled patience, he guided her upright, keeping one arm firm behind her back. The world tilted for a moment, snow and sky blurring together, but then she was seated, supported, no longer flat against the freezing ground. She felt small beside him, yet not diminished. The warmth from his arms seeped through her coat, chasing away the biting chill. Around them, the pack watched their king choose compassion over rigid law, and something in the atmosphere shifted. Strength, they were beginning to see, did not always stand alone. Sometimes it knelt, lifted, and carried. Emily's vision steadied as she sat upright, Adrian's arm firm and unwavering behind her back, the warmth from his body cutting through the bitter chill that had begun to sink too deep. The snow beneath them was no longer an enemy but a quiet witness, clinging to the hem of his coat and melting slowly where his presence radiated heat. She became aware of the field again, of the hundreds of eyes fixed on them, of the sacred boundary that had just been crossed. Her pulse quickened, not from pain this time, but from the magnitude of what he had done. "Your Majesty," Beta Marcus said again, more carefully now, stepping forward just enough to be heard. "The rules are clear. If we make exceptions, the trial loses meaning." His words were not defiant, only bound by duty. Tradition had shaped this pack for generations. Adrian lifted his gaze from Emily at last, turning it toward his Beta. The look in his eyes was calm, but beneath it lay something unyielding. "Meaning is not found in watching one of our own suffer to prove a point," he replied. Evenly, his voice carried across the clearing without force, yet it reached every ear. The statement settled over the field like a new law being written in real time. Emily felt the tension ripple through the crowd, confusion mixing with something softer, something uncertain. A young wolf near the front lowered his head, as though reconsidering what strength truly looked like. Adrian shifted slightly, adjusting his support behind her back. "Can you feel your feet?" he asked her quietly, returning his attention to her, as if the entire pack had faded away. Emily focused, drawing a slow breath. She willed sensation downward, concentrating past the ache and stiffness. There was a faint tingling now, subtle but present. A little, she whispered, surprised by the small spark of relief. He nodded once, satisfied. Good. That means this is temporary. The certainty in his tone steadied her more than any reassurance could have. He slid his other arm carefully beneath her knees, pausing just long enough for her to brace herself. I am going to lift you, he said, giving her control through knowledge, not force. She nodded faintly, trusting him despite the tremor in her chest. With controlled strength, he rose to his feet, bringing her with him, cradled securely against his chest. A collective gasp moved through the clearing, not from scandal, but from awe. Snow shifted under his boots as he stood tall once more. Emily held safely in his arms, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. She could feel the steady beat of his heart through layers of wool and fabric, strong and unshaken. From this height, the field looked different. Smaller, less overwhelming. Adrian turned slowly, facing the gathered pack, his expression resolute. The purpose of this trial, he declared, his voice carrying clean and clear through the winter air, is to measure courage. She has already proven hers. The words did not roar. They did not need to. Silence followed, deep and reflective, as the pack absorbed the shift in meaning. Emily felt something change within her, not in her body, but in the way she was being seen. Not as a failure on the snow, but as someone worth lifting. The weight of Emily in his arms did not slow Adrian's stride as he stepped forward across the frozen clearing. Each measured step deliberate, unhurried, undeniable. Snow compressed beneath his boots, leaving a clear path through the proving field that had moments ago felt like a place of judgment. Now it felt like something else entirely. Emily's fingers curled slightly against the front of his coat, not gripping, simply steadying herself as the world moved around her. She could still feel the lingering ache in her lower back, but it had softened, dulled by warmth and by the unshakable security of being held without hesitation. The pack parted instinctively as he approached, creating a silent corridor. No one commanded them to move. They simply did. Beta Marcus stood at the edge of that opening, his expression no longer rigid with protest but contemplative, as though he were witnessing the rewriting of a rule he had memorized since childhood. Adrian paused at the center of the clearing and turned slowly, ensuring every wolf present could see both his face and the omega he carried. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat, lifting it slightly, but his stance remained solid, grounded. Strength, he said, his voice calm yet resonant enough to carry across the entire field, is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let pain define who you are. The words settled into the snow-covered ground like seeds beneath winter frost. Emily felt her throat tighten, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being defended openly. He did not speak as though excusing her failure. He spoke as though redefining it. Adrian shifted his hold just enough to look down at her again. You crossed nearly a mile of ice before you fell, he reminded her quietly. You did not stop when the wind turned against you. You did not quit when the ground became unstable. That is resilience. His voice softened on the last word, but it did not lose its authority. Around them, something subtle changed in the pack's posture. Shoulders that had been squared in silent judgment eased slightly. A few wolves lowered their gazes, not in shame, but in reflection. The younger ones watched with wide eyes, absorbing a lesson that would linger far longer than any winter trial. Emily drew a careful breath and tested her legs again, shifting slightly within his arms. The tingling sensation had grown stronger, sensation returning like warmth creeping back into frostbitten fingers. I think I can stand soon, she murmured, surprise threading through her voice. Adrian's eyes held her steadily. Then you will stand, he replied, not as a command, but as a promise. He did not immediately set her down. He allowed her time, allowed her body to catch up to her will. In that patience was another quiet defiance of the rigid pace the trial demanded. Snow continued to fall lightly around them, dusting the shoulders of wolves who no longer looked upon the scene with confusion, but with something gentler. Respect was shifting its shape, not because a king had displayed dominance, but because he had chosen compassion without surrendering his strength. And in his arms, Emily no longer felt like the omega who had fallen. She felt like someone being lifted into a new understanding of what power truly meant. Emily shifted slightly in Adrian's arms, drawing in a deeper breath as sensation continued to return to her legs in cautious waves. The cold no longer felt like it owned her body. It was retreating, inch by inch, replaced by warmth and a fragile but growing strength. She lifted her chin, looking out over the clearing from the safety of his hold. Faces that had once seemed distant and judgmental now looked different. Curious, thoughtful. A few even softened with quiet admiration. Adrian felt the subtle change in her posture. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. His voice meant only for her despite the crowd. She nodded, swallowing the last remnants of fear. "Yes," she answered, and this time her voice did not tremble. Slowly, carefully, he lowered her feet toward the snow. He did not release her completely. One arm remained steady at her back, the other ready at her side. Her boots touched the ground. For a brief second the world tilted again, but she focused on the rhythm of her breathing and the steady presence at her side. The tingling in her legs strengthened, becoming sensation instead of numbness. She straightened a little more, then another inch, then fully upright. A quiet murmur spread through the pack, not disbelief now, but recognition. She was standing. Adrian kept his hand at her waist a moment longer, not restraining, simply ensuring she was balanced. "On your own," he said softly. Emily hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping forward without his support. The snow held firm beneath her boots. The ache in her back remained, but it no longer dictated her posture. She stood tall in the center of the clearing, shoulders squared, breath steady. The wind brushed against her hair, lifting it slightly, as if acknowledging the shift. Adrian turned toward the pack once more. "Remember this moment," he said, his tone neither raised nor harsh, but firm enough to echo across the field. "Not because she fell, not because I stepped down. Remember it because she rose." The words carried weight far beyond the frozen ground beneath them. Emily felt heat bloom in her chest, stronger than the cold had ever been. It was not pride alone. It was belonging. She glanced at Adrian, and for the first time since the fall, she allowed herself a small, steady smile. He returned it with the faintest curve of his lips, an unspoken acknowledgement that she had done the hardest part herself. Around them, the pack began to respond. One by one, wolves lowered their heads in quiet respect. Not commanded, not demanded, chosen. Beta Marcus was the first among the leadership to bow slightly, his gesture deliberate and sincere. The movement rippled outward until the entire clearing reflected the same posture. Snow continued to fall lightly, settling on shoulders and hair, but no one seemed to notice. In the center of it all stood Emily Carter, no longer defined by the moment she could not move, but by the moment she chose to stand. And beside her stood Adrian Blackwood, not above her, not distant, but aligned with her, as the pack witnessed a new understanding of strength take root beneath the winter sky. The bowed heads remained lowered for several long seconds, the only sound in the clearing the soft whisper of falling snow and the steady breath of nearly 200 wolves standing in shared stillness. Emily felt the weight of that silence, not heavy with judgment as before, but full, almost reverent. She had never stood at the center of the proving field without wanting to disappear. Now she stood there without wanting to shrink. The ache in her back lingered, but it no longer frightened her. It reminded her that she had endured something and risen beyond it. Adrian stepped forward until he stood beside her rather than slightly in front of her, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed. He was not shielding her now. He was standing with her. "Lift your heads," he said. Calmly. The pack obeyed, eyes rising as one. There was no defiance in them, no resentment at the broken tradition. Instead, there was reflection, as if each wolf were recalibrating what strength meant in their own life. Beta Marcus cleared his throat gently. "The trial will continue," he announced, his voice steady. But there was a new tone beneath it, less rigid, more thoughtful. "But it will continue with understanding." Several younger wolves exchanged glances, absorbing that word. Understanding. It had rarely been paired with endurance before. Emily drew in a slow breath and shifted her weight deliberately from one foot to the other. The snow crunched beneath her boots, firm and reliable. She took a single step forward, then another, testing the steadiness of her legs. Each step felt like a quiet declaration. She was not being carried now. She was choosing to move. Adrian watched her without hovering, allowing space while remaining close enough that his presence was undeniable. "Do you wish to finish?" he asked her softly. It was not a command. It was a question that restored her agency fully. Emily looked toward the stretch of icy ground that marked the final yards of the course. It was less than 50 feet away, so close it almost seemed symbolic. She swallowed once, feeling both the weight of the pack's gaze and the strength gathering inside her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. A subtle spark lit Adrian's silver eyes, not surprise, but pride. He stepped back, giving her the path. The clearing parted again, but this time not for him. For her. Emily began to walk toward the final marker. Each step was careful but determined. The wind pressed lightly against her coat, snowflakes brushing her cheeks, but she did not falter. When she reached the wooden post marking the end of the mile, she laid her gloved hand against it and held it there for a breath. The gesture was simple, yet the meaning was undeniable. A wave of quiet approval rolled through the pack, not loud or celebratory, but deeply felt. Adrian's voice carried once more across the field. "Let it be recorded that Emily Carter completed the winter trial." The words were official, final, and transforming. Emily turned back toward the pack, no longer the Omega who fell short, but the one who crossed the final distance on her own terms, while a king stood witness not to her weakness, but to her courage. The clearing did not erupt into cheers. It did not need to. What followed was quieter, deeper, something that settled into bone and memory. Emily stood with her hand still resting lightly against the wooden marker, the cold seeping through her glove, but no longer commanding her body. Snow continued to fall in soft, steady flakes, dusting the proving field in a fresh layer of white, as if the earth itself were smoothing over what had happened, not to erase it, but to preserve it. When she turned back fully toward the pack, she did not lower her gaze. She met their eyes. Not challengingly, not timidly, simply present. Adrian watched her from several yards away, his posture relaxed but grounded, the authority he carried now intertwined with something warmer. He did not step forward immediately. He allowed the moment to belong to her. The younger wolves were the first to shift, their expressions open, almost awed. One of the older hunters nodded slowly, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than applause. Beta Marcus stepped closer to the center of the field, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Let this winter be remembered," he said carefully. "Not for the one who fell, but for the one who rose." The statement sealed what had already begun to take root. Emily felt the words settle into her chest like a steady flame. The fear that had once pressed so tightly against her ribs was gone. In its place was something steadier, something earned. Adrian finally crossed the remaining distance between them, his boots leaving firm impressions in the snow. He stopped at her side, not towering, not overshadowing. Simply there. For a brief moment their eyes met again, and in that silent exchange was recognition. He had stepped down from the platform. She had stepped back onto her feet. Neither action had diminished them. Together, they had shifted something far greater than a single trial. Adrian turned toward the pack one last time. "Strength is measured in many ways," he said, his voice calm and resolute. "Today, you witnessed one that will define this pack long after winter fades." No grand proclamation followed. No dramatic flourish. Only truth carried on winter air. Emily inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the crisp scent of pine and frost. The field that had felt so vast and unforgiving now felt like part of her story, not her downfall. When Adrian extended his arm, not to carry her, but to walk beside her, she accepted it without hesitation. Together they began to move toward the edge of the clearing, side by side, their pace unhurried. Behind them, the pack followed in quiet formation, not out of obligation, but out of shared understanding. Snow covered the marks where she had fallen, but it did not erase what had happened. It preserved it, and as they left the proving field, there was no longer any doubt that something had changed. Not just in how the pack saw Emily Carter, but in how they understood power itself. True strength had knelt in the snow that day, and in doing so, it had lifted everyone.